Hey guys, just a quick voiceover Robin before we get into this video. I had planned a bunch of things and then my face swelled up. I don't know what's going on. We're gonna get to the bottom of it on Thursday. But in the meantime, I don't particularly want to be on camera. I don't really need the visual reminder of that. So, this video was originally filmed for a kind of lecture that Trevor Smith asked me to do for the going viral virtual non-festival that happened a few months ago. I really liked how it came out, and he gave me permission to share it. So I wanted to share it with everyone. It is kind of a rehashing of a lot of videos I've made before, but I think it's more streamlined and maybe a little bit more interesting and a little bit better, and I hope you guys enjoy.
Hello, my name is Robin Mixons. I am a flutist based in Chicago, Illinois, and I specialize in contemporary music and improvisation. I'm going to talk to you guys about contemporary techniques and notation. I'm going to say contemporary technique and contemporary sound instead of extended technique, just because it, at least for flutists, is a little bit more of an approachable term, and I find that it doesn't create the same fear that extended technique does. So it is a very small semantic thing for me, but I do prefer saying contemporary technique. So I'm going to try to go through as many techniques as I can. Obviously, I have a time frame to get through, but I want to talk about some of the intricacies of each technique and a little bit less about the sounds of each one, because I think that's something that's easy to find. And we're also going to talk about notation, because that's something that I don't see as much, and it's very, very difficult because a lot of these aren't super codified or super standard. There's a few that are, but even those are a little flexible, and so I'm going to talk about what my preferred notation is and why. Obviously you guys are welcome to use whatever notation that you want, but I will say that as a flutist, this is something that I do really prefer. So, I'm going to start with the more standard, easier to explain ones, and then we're going to get into the slightly more amorphous ones. The first one I always start with is Flutter Tongue. I think Flutter Tongue is the most standard contemporary sound you can have. At this point, I don't think there's a flutist who's playing professionally who doesn't know how to do it. So much of our even standard rep has it. A lot of the turn of the century French composers, the Bear Concerto, Messin, Le Mer Noir, a lot of French composers use it, and so it's pretty much required as a flute major to learn how to flutter tongue. The one thing that I do caution people with is that they like to specify whether you use front flutter or tongue flutter or guttural or throat flutter. I don't think this is a viable thing, mainly because it's a physical limitation. It's a genetic thing whether you can roll your R's in the front or back. Some people can't at all and they find some way to figure out a flutter sound, but specifying that sound doesn't make a difference. I think you can create the sound of a front flutter with a guttural flutter if you ask it to be brighter. And you can create a guttural flutter with a front flutter by asking it to be darker. And I think that's a much better thing to ask for than this front or back thing, because personally, I can't do front flutter. I'm never going to be able to. So it's asking me to do something that's impossible when you could easily get around that by asking for a darker or brighter sound. The other thing with flutter is that it does have to have some amount of sustain to really be heard. So obviously, very clear what's going on. Also very clear. A little bit harder. I think if it's more than about an eighth, you're fine. Or if it's a sustained passage. If it's fast notes sustained, that's very easy. But if it's a single like flutter tongue hit, that is questionable, and you might want to think about something else, a different technique or a different sound, or lengthening the note length a little bit. This one I think is the only one that has like a really standard no questions asked notation, and that is this. I will say that if you have concerns about a flutist reading it, just put FLZ over the 3 dash in the stem note head and you'll be fine. If you're really worried about it, add it into the key, but considering the number of standard repertoire pieces that have it notated like that, I think you're probably okay. That one, yeah, it's pretty consistent throughout the ranges. It doesn't require any setup time, and it's pretty hard to mess that one up as long as it's longer, as long as it's long enough to speak. So the next one I want to talk about is key clicks. This one is also pretty standard in my eyes. It was in Varese, density 21.5. So we have a pretty good understanding of it. I will say key clicks are something that some flutists will not do. They think it hurts the pads of their flute. I do not agree, but that is a personal thing that they have the right to say. So do be aware that sometimes flutists will not do that. They are a single dynamic, like they don't get much louder. And if you want that click, they're gonna be one dynamic. I don't always love them in an ensemble texture just because you don't really hear them most of the time. And they will always sound in the lower octave. You can get some higher ones if you're fingering high notes, but they don't have some of the same oomph to them just because they're skimming off the top of the harmonic series and you don't get as much of the fundamental. They are a percussive sound, so they have one duration. And do be careful of ascending key clicks. So obviously descending, really easy. But as I ascend, I have to find a key to click. So as we're ascending, because we're lifting keys, you have to find a key that won't adjust the pitch to click. So it's going to take longer. Apart from that, it really doesn't have any setup time, and as long as it's in a situation where you can be heard, it's pretty easy. You can add them to any pitch on the flute. Sometimes it'll add a little bit of delay to that just because you have to get the accent and the articulation at the same time. But to be perfectly honest, that's a flutist's problem, and that's something that they should be working on themselves, not necessarily something that you should worry about. Notation-wise, I think there's a gold standard. I know that some people don't agree with me, but for me, X note head is key click with no pitch, and an X on the stem of a regular note head is key click with pitch. For me, these are the golden standard. And that's really what I prefer to see. And if I see that in a piece, I'm going to assume it's a key click if you use an X note head. Like, it's very hard for me to read things otherwise because so many contemporary composers have been using it for so long. It's in Ferneyhough, it's in Varese, it's in Takemitsu. There's so many pieces that you learn younger that have these X's in them that mean key clicks that it's really hard to relearn that. The next one is my personal favorite sound on flute, percussive-wise at least, and that is slap tongue. Slap tongue is again another percussive sound, so it has one duration. It has about two dynamics. The true slap tongues are going to be one dynamic, but you can also get this one. But obviously the louder ones are going to carry better. I actually do think that if you want some pitch and a really hard percussive hit, use slap tongue over a key click, just because it's going to project better. There is a little bit of setup time with slap tongues, and there's a little bit of setup time in successive slap tongues. So it's not like some of the, like a jet whistle or something like that, where once you're set, you're set. It requires reaction, because it's a very large tongue movement. So unlike regular articulation, where we're so used to going back and forth and we can reset really quickly, that's why we can articulate so fast, this has a lot slower reaction time. So if you're asking for 16th notes, you might not get them all to be slap tongue, and if you want alternating slap tongue and regular pitch notes, the tempo does have to be taken into account. Personally, I can do about 120 alternating and about 100 consistently, but that really depends on how long the passage is and how long I've been working on it. But just be careful of the tempo when you're doing slap tongue. Again, this is another one where it will only sound in the first octave. Again, you can get the higher notes, but they don't sound as good. I really recommend using the lower octave. It just has more effect. And for me, again, this one has a really gold standard notation for me. We're getting into the kind of amorphous notation already. For me though, a accent note head is my gold standard. That's exactly what I want to see when I ask for slap tongue notation, and that's the one that I'm always going to assume is a slap tongue notation. This one again just shows up in Fernihau, in Takamitsu, in a lot of the like turn of the century contemporary repertoire. So for someone who's been studying contemporary music for as long as I have, it's something that really clicks in my brain of, oh, it's a slap tongue, easy. So honestly, it's also hard if you use it for other things, if you use the accent note head for other things, because then we have to retrain our brains. So a lot of the notation is going with what other people have established, just because we've learned it already and it makes our lives easier. It makes me more willing to play your piece if I understand the notation and it's clear and it doesn't require me to retrain my brain after 15 years of learning how to do this stuff. So, next one is tongue ram. This one, again, is a percussive technique. It has one dynamic and it has one duration. So you're sensing a theme here. This one does have true pitch though. It will be about a seventh lower than the notated pitch. I think there's something weird that happens with alto flute. I don't really know the physics of it. That is something that you can, I'm sure you can look up, I'm sorry. But there is a little bit of setup in the actual physical articulation, and there's definitely setup when you start a passage because you have to roll the flute into your mouth. With that, it's like a second at most that you need, but it needs to be there. Like, you can't go directly into or out of tongue ram without some kind of rest. Either that or the flute is just going to create some kind of rest and ruin your musical flow. So just think about that. Give us setup time, especially for this one and the next one I'm going to talk about. It does, again, have the same issue where it will always speak in the lower octave unless you're fingering high notes, in which case it doesn't sound right. Most of the percussive techniques just kind of fall into the physics of the flute because you don't have an embouchure to control the second octave. So just be aware of that. I see a lot of high tongue rams that I just can't do and I have to talk to composers about. And it's way easier if you just write it in the lower octave to begin with, because that's what I'm gonna do with it. My preferred notation is this. So you have both the fundamental and the approximate sounding pitch. That just twigs me into it is a tongue ram. The only thing that it could be otherwise is singing and playing, and most people don't write the sung part in that octave. Also make sure that it's always notated in your key, but as long as you have those two pitches, it's pretty easy. I do see a lot of people using an X as one of the note heads, and that's totally fair. Just keep in mind that if you want to add a key click, which you totally can, you have to figure out how to do that as well. So you might have to put an X on the stem as well as using the X note head, but that's a call that's up to you. But yeah, you can add key clicks to these things. They're kind of cool. Yeah, the percussive sounds are pretty straightforward as long as you put them in the right octave, and don't try to get them to be louder or softer than they are. The next one is jet whistle, and this is one of my most contentious techniques because it takes such a physical toll on the flutist. I have an entire Sandalwood video where I basically rant about this, so I'm going to keep it short, but it is a very, very physical sound. So it requires me to basically empty my lungs into the flute, which is forcing a lot of air into very small space, which is putting a lot of back pressure on me. And it also means that I'm emptying my lungs very quickly. So if you're asking me to do it a lot very quickly, I'm going to hyperventilate. So be very careful with how many you put in a piece, how many in a row you put in a piece, and if a flutist tells you it's too much, do listen to that. To me, they don't really have that much pitch. I think a good one should have kind of that up and down sound. So I wouldn't recommend notating too much pitch. You can ask for a starting note, but keep in mind the longer the tube, the better the sound. So if you really want a really good one, ask for a low D or a low C. And if you want kind of a wimpy one, you can ask for a C5, but I don't particularly recommend it. It's a lot of work for not a lot of payoff. They pretty much have one dynamic, and they do have a required duration. You can make them a little bit longer, but that does also matter based on the lung capacity, because to get that whooshing sound properly, you have to get your airspeed fast enough, which means that it really depends on the capacity of your lungs. So I would say give it about a quarter note to a half note based on your tempo, and don't ask for much after it. It does take a little bit to reset. It also does have some setup time, obviously, because it requires you to roll the flute into and out of your mouth. So it's something that I think is really best by itself or surrounded by in the flute technique. So you can do like tongue rams into a jet whistle, also remembering that you do have to breathe. You have to take a full breath in to be able to do one. So there does have to be more time than for a percussive technique, which is all in the tongue. My preferred notation for jet whistle is this. This one's very, very hard to codify. I would say best bet, note head, line, jet whistle. Just write jet whistle. It's easier. If you write it, we know what you mean. But I think like a note head and some kind of descending or ascending line into the staff or out of the staff is a pretty good indication, as long as it also says jet whistle, because it could also mean a pitch bend if you don't identify it as a jet whistle. That's one of the ones where I wouldn't necessarily know what it means on a page without any words, so just put the words in. I think before I get to the end of this video, but I'm gonna say this now, I think the best advice I could ever give to a composer is, if you have any doubts about your notation, just write the words. If you have any question whether someone's gonna be able to understand what you're saying, just write the words of what you mean. Do it in the score, do it in the key, do it however you want, but just write the physical words. Do not leave it up to the performer, because we will guess and we might get it wrong. The next one I want to talk about is whistle tone. Whistle tone has one dynamic. It's very, very quiet. They can be stabilized. It does take a lot of practice. So my best recommendation for whistle tone is use it as a color thing. Also be very careful of the texture, because if you have anything playing with it, you will not hear it. In a solo flute piece, it can be cool, especially if you're in a small space or an amplified space. But be very, very careful with this technique. It's a lot of work for not a lot of payoff. And when the flutists get nervous, it gets harder. It is a very difficult thing to do, because you're losing all of your support system for the air. And that's something that we're not trained to do. So if we get nervous, our body goes support, 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 support. And it becomes very hard to tell, like, oh no, this is what we're supposed to be doing. Do not support. Please do not support. There is a different version of whistle tones. These were invented by Sciarrino. I do not recommend writing these if the person who is playing the piece has not told you explicitly that they can do these. It was very, very difficult for me to learn, and it's something that I'm still working on now. They are even more nerve-wracking. They require very, very perfect lip placement, and obviously they're an in the flute technique, so that requires even more time. I will say they are louder and they are more stable, but unless the flutist has committed to learning them or already knows how to do them, be very careful about them. And you do also have to figure out how to specify that one. I think this is the time to use all of the words physically possible and reference Sciarrino's music. please reference Fiorino's music, because this comes directly out of his music, and we will not be able to find any references to it unless you have referenced his music. However, normal whistle tones, I would prefer to be seen notated like this. If you don't have any preference on fundamental, just put some random notes into a box and say whistle tone. If you do have a preferred fundamental, then I think put that fundamental and then put a wavy line if you want it to waver, and put a straight line if you don't. I don't see this technique in a lot of the standard repertoire. I see it a lot in younger composers, which is great. It's really cool to see, but do be careful about amplification. I think it's really best used in an amplified piece just because it is really very quiet. The next thing I want to talk about are pure air sounds. There are three types in my eyes. There's pure noise, there's pitched air, and then there's half and half pitched air. I think for this one, I'm gonna have to talk about notation before I talk about the intricacies of it, because notation is probably the most intricate part of this. So this is my general air sound without pitch notation preference. I do, if you want a specific syllable, ask that you say that. So if you want a f sound or a sh sound or whatever vowel or consonant sound you want, put a little notation in the top and with a line, how long it goes, if it transitions into something, give it an arrow, like give us an idea of what you want. If you want pure noise, know that it will always have some pitch. You can obscure that pitch a little bit, but it will always be there. If you want that sound, just write noise and then put the note head that indicates air. And if you do want a pitch, write the pitch you want. And I would always put a syllable, honestly. But if you don't have a preference, then just put air. Then we get into the half and half, and that's part of the fun, is that it doesn't always have to be half and half. My preferred notation for the half and half is this. That symbol above the staff is incredibly important to me because that does indicate that you want some true pitch. And while I don't have a great example of the way I would love to see it, if you want more than 50-50, if you want 60-40 sound, or 60-40 sound to air, whatever it is, put that ratio on that measure. So if you want 80% air and just a tiny bit of pitch, write that and indicate that, because it is possible to do that, but you do have to specify that, or else we're going to default to 50-50, because that's usually what that notation does mean. There are obviously ways to adjust it. With the notation covered, we'll get into some of the flute problems. The biggest one is that it requires more air, so you're gonna have to give us more time to breathe, and the dynamic, as always, is a problem. There's not much we can do to make it project more because we're not using our embouchures the same way, and you have to obscure the embouchure to be able to get the air, so you are pretty limited in its dynamic range. I would say for pure air, either noise or pitch, I would say it's like a piano to a mezzo forte, maybe forte if it's noise. And for half and half, depending on the ratio, it changes. If it's more air, the quieter it's going to be. If it's more sound, the louder it can be. If you're doing 80-20 sound to air, you can get the majority of the dynamic range of the flute, but if you're doing 80-20 air to sound, it's gonna be more piano to mezzo. So just be aware of that. The noise air and the pitched air can only be on the lower end of the flute. Can you find a theme in this? Anything that doesn't have an actual embouchure, you can't do above D5. I'm gonna put that out there. If you do want pitch, it can be on any pitch, and it's pretty flexible apart from that. I think it does have the same rule as Flutter Tongue does, where it has to have some duration or else it's just not gonna be worth it. It's probably about an eighth note to a quarter note, again, depending on tempo. Now the next one is my personal favorite sound that has pitch, and that is singing and playing. And this one is where we're gonna have to talk a lot because there's a lot of weirdness with this. I'm going to start with notation just because there are two options with notation. The first is to have the vocal pitch and the flute pitch in the same staff. So that means if you're writing for alto flute, it will be a transposed pitch. So if your performer has perfect pitch, you might want to think about the second option. But examples of what I prefer to see, at least in the same staff notation, are these. Basically, you tell me which note head is which. So one stem's going down, one stem's going up. You tell me which one's the vocal line and which one's the flute line, and I go from there. I will say I prefer this because I don't have perfect pitch, and I tend to read these lines based on the reference pitch of the flute. So I'm going, okay, I'm singing a third lower than the flute, or I'm singing an eighth lower than the flute, and then I'm moving up a fifth from where I am. So it's all relative intervals rather than the pitches themselves. If I read alto flute music, I don't care what the actual transposed vocal sounds are. I'm going off the alto flute's pitch. So, and I know a lot of flutists do prefer that. The other option is in two staves. So you have a flute line and you have a vocal line, obviously labeled and kind of in a grand staff system. This way, if they have perfect pitch, it's easier because they can see it better. You can have transposed pitches, again, if they have perfect pitch. And the other thing that can be really good is if you have something where the lines cross a lot, you don't have the problem of all of these note heads crammed together. A good example of this is here. It is important to keep track of your vocal line and where it's going in relation to the flute line, because if it does cross too many times, you probably want to put it on a second staff. Now, we get into some of the complications with this technique. The main one being voice type. For those of you who know my playing, I have a very low voice. I can sing a D3 on a good day, so if you write a piece for someone like me and use that low range in my voice, that changes the group of people who can play it. Also, if you write it for someone with a really high voice or with a baritone or a bass voice, that again changes the group of people that can play it. If you're willing to allow people to transpose, then it doesn't matter. You can put it in whatever octave the premier player is going to play it in and say, you can transpose this in octaves based on your voice type. Cool. That, however, does change the interaction with the flute. So, it's a very different sound. So if you're going for a very specific sound where you want that octave distortion, then you might have to specify that this is for bass voice or for soprano voice or whatever it is. I would definitely stay away from gender terms because that creates a whole mess of problems that are not worth going into when you can just say soprano voice. That is a voice type, it has nothing to do with gender. But the other thing is you can add separate dynamics for the vocal and the flute line. This is easier if you are doing it in separate staves, obviously, though that does create the multitasking problem where a lot of flutists are not great at doing multiple things at once if they're in separate staves. We are not pianists most of the time, and it makes it harder, but that's a flute problem, and for the most part, those are things that we get to work out on our own. But if you want to think about it, that's something that I think is acceptable to work into a piece as a composer. The other huge thing with this is reference pitches. Again, not many of us have perfect pitch. If they do, cool, fine, but also think about the next person who might play the piece, might not have perfect pitch, and that might make it harder. As long as I have either the ability to ghost a note, so go, so I can kind of quickly make a very quiet sound where I can hear it in my ear and then keep going. It's almost like a tuning fork. Or you just have the voice come out of unison with the flute and then move. those are my favorite ways. The other good way is to have the note before the voice comes in be the note that the voice comes in on. It's basically the same way as if you're writing for a singer where the reference pitch has to be somewhere. We just don't always have piano or some accompaniment with us. So you do have to kind of create the reference pitch in the flute voice. I will say that this is a technique that does take a lot of practice. It's something that I specialize in, so it's something that I am very comfortable with, but I do know that a lot of younger players or more inexperienced players are less comfortable with this. It does take a little bit of time. So, well, obviously it's a great sound and I think you should use it because I'm very biased. Do be careful if you're working with a performer who is not as comfortable with contemporary music. The final thing I want to talk about, and as my lighting changes completely, is multiphonics. There are two kinds. There are natural and there are artificial multiphonics. Natural multiphonics go off the physics of the flute and they are based on regular fingerings. They are much more difficult than artificial multiphonics. Artificial ones, as you can probably assume, are with altered fingerings that create basically just that pitch, which makes it easier, obviously. With artificial multiphonics, and I will not let you argue with me on this one, you must give a fingering. I don't care if you reference your source. I might not have access to that source. Just put the fingering somewhere in the score. It doesn't have to be on the multiphonic itself. It can be in a key or on a separate page, but please give us the fingering. I will say this because, one, it is very difficult to sometimes trace these multiphonics, even if you give us the source, again, because we might not have access to it, and some of them are in other languages that we do not speak. And each flute is different, the physics are different, and so sometimes the fingering won't work exactly, but if we get close to it, we can adjust it for our flute. If we're trying to find it out of thin air, it might not work, and it is so much easier if you just put it in the score. You don't have to make a nice font for it. You can just put numbers and the flute. Just find some way to put the fingering in the score. That's all I'm asking. Now that I've ranted about that, I think the easiest way to notate a multiphonic is to just write the notes that you want to speak. If you're using singing and playing, you might just have to write multiphonic or put a reference to where it is in the key so someone knows that it is a multiphonic. But if there's no other notation and there's multiple pitches, I'm going to assume it's a multiphonic. For the natural multiphonics, be a little bit careful. They're going to be a little more unstable and they're going to be harder to speak. So they might take a little bit of time or you might not get them all the time. And that's true with some of the artificial ones as well. I will say most of the resources give you really, really good notes on stability and also dynamic. So listen to those. They're written by flutists for the most part, and if you're using a reputable one like Robert Dix, the other flute, is the easiest one to reference, then believe it, he's an excellent flutist and he does know what he's doing. The last one I want to talk about, which is actually one of the more simple ones, I just forgot about it earlier, is harmonics. And with this one, there's a pretty standard notation of the little circle above the note, looking like this. I will say, however, with that notation, write the sounding pitch. Do not write the fundamental unless you have a specific fundamental you want, in which case write both pitches and make sure you put that little circle, or else you'll think it's a multiphonic. The circle is the universal indicator of a harmonic. It's true in almost every instrument that can play harmonics. That one's not changing. But I will say, because you can create many different pitches on the different fundamentals, if you have a specific one you want to use, please do specify, and if you don't, just write the sounding pitch that you want and then put the harmonic symbol. They generally are played without vibrato, and the higher you get into the partials, the harder it will be to get and the louder it will be. So if you want like a pretty shimmering harmonic in the high range, I would recommend not putting a fundamental, because you can find the flutist is going to know better which fundamental to use that will have that nice little like piano harmonic rather than kind of a honking fifth partial harmonic. Harmonics are pretty simple apart from that. The biggest thing is whether you want the fundamental or not specified. Yeah, I think that's about all of the techniques that I can think of right now that are used very commonly. If you want to see more specific videos about each technique, I have made quite a few. They're on my YouTube channel, which is just my name. I also have some overview videos and like 700 other videos. So if you want to see more of me and my playing, please go check out my channel. I am also Robin Makesons on Instagram and Facebook. So if you want to talk to me more about notation or about flute sounds, please let me know. I want to say a huge thank you to Trevor for having me virtually talk to you guys. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. Unfortunately, I'm also an essential worker and I work 9 to 5 right now. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me either on social media, or my email is my firstname.lastname@gmail.com. And I hope you guys have a great rest of the festival.